Hi, good evening. Hoping you're doing great. I already missed you. I know that you're doing your midterms and you're preparing for your semester midterm. I wish you all the best and hope you're doing great in your exams. Meanwhile, let's complete what we already started to talk, democracy and human rights. Democracy is part of our life. It is not something rigid or abstract. It is there everywhere. We have democracy in our families, in our relations, friendships, etc., etc. But as we agreed, we're going to discuss things from historical theoretical background. Then we're going to move to talk about something very practical and exciting. Meanwhile, let's postpone what we already started to talk about. Let's follow what we already discussed, and let's start with our lecture number 7. If you still remember, we talked about the historical track of the growth of democracy, and we said we have a historical track started with maybe Greek civilization. So let's talk more about this period. During the classical period of Greek or the ancient civilization, corresponding roughly to maybe the 5th and 4th centuries before BCE, Greece was, of course, not a country in the modern sense, but a collection of several hundred independent city-states. You know the structure when we had colonization, people occupied other states for certain wars, etc. So it is a collective structure of community, each with its surrounding countryside. In late 507 BCE, under the leadership of Cleophanes, the citizens of Athens began to develop a system of popular rule that would last nearly 2 centuries. Do you still remember the questions we raised in lecture number 6? During this lecture, we are trying to answer these questions in a way. So, according to question number 1, the Greeks responded clearly to the dilemma of development of democracy in the sense that the political association most appropriate to democratic government is the polis or city-state. They were seeing that the city-state is the pattern, is the modern definition and implementation according to their perspective and their time. Athenian democracy first had down some later democratic practices, even among people who knew little or nothing actually of the Athenian system. Thus, the Athenian answer to question number 2, who should constitute the demos, was similar to the answer developed in many newly democratic countries in the 19th and 20th century. And this is a very interesting thing to know and to discuss. It is not about whether it is ancient or modern. It is like even the Athenian people still have a very closer perspective to whatever going on in the 19th century. Although citizenship in Athens wasn't something cleared or known as it is known nowadays, it wasn't heredity or at least explicit idea to everyone, but it was extending to everyone who was born and parents who were themselves Athenian citizens. So they created or brought the idea of citizenship relevant to the original citizens of Athena. The idea of membership in the demos was limited to male citizens who are like more or above 18 years old or older. And the most exciting part here, they were excluding women completely of this. Women were totally, completely excluded from the idea of citizenship. So, in a way to answer question number two, who are the citizens or who constitute the demos, we can say that the definition of citizens is everyone who is above 18, only from male and from original Athens parents. Because data is scanty, estimates of the size of the Athenian demos must be treated with very careful tools and perspectives. One scholar has suggested that in the mid-4th century, there may have been about almost 100,000 citizens, 10,000 resident foreigners, or maybe we can say others like in the middle. Why we had like 150,000 slaves. This huge number is a little bit scary because these slaves were not counted as citizens. They were excluded from all the calculations. So among citizens, about 3,000 were males over 18. If these numbers are roughly corrected, then the demos comprise 10 to 15% of the total population. Can you imagine that only 10 to 15% of the population are allowed to speak, are allowed to participate, are counted in the system? Regarding question number 3, let's just remember the question together. What political institutions are necessary for governing? The Athenians adopted an answer that would appear independently elsewhere. The heart and the center of their government was the assembly. They had certain structure or assembly that represent the noble, represent the level of the structure, the class that called the higher structure of the government. They call this ecclesias, or it is a name like we have a parliament, we have like any other names, so it is only about the structure. This structure or this assembly met almost weekly, maybe 40 times a year, or it depends also on the political situation actually. Decisions were taken by voting. And voting on certain ideas that only the members of this assembly suggested. In many later assemblies, voting was by a show of hands. They are only raising their hands, no more or less. As would also be true in many later democratic systems, the votes of a majority of those present and voting prevailed. They were counting the number of the attendees and count the votes. Although we have no way of knowing how closely the majority in the assembly represented the much larger number of eligible citizens who didn't attend, given the frequency of meetings and the accessibility of the meeting place, it is unlikely that the assembly could have long persisted in making markedly unpopular decisions. Like it is not about having this to gather together or to vote or to practice a democratic attitude, whether it is by voting, raising hand, or whatever. if they are not representing people themselves, if they start representing the minority, even if the majority of the assembly take the decision, we need to have in our mind that they are only representing minority, that 10 percentage we talked about. The powers of the assembly were broad, but they were by no means unlimited. And this was actually the most dangerous point about the assembly. They had a huge package of assemblies and of privileged powers, authorities. No one can say no for this assembly. The agenda of the assembly was set by the Council of 500. You know, we had like a movie called The Round Table and the 500 actually. Unlike the Assembly, 500 Council was composed of representatives chosen by lot from each of the territories. Each city or each territory, they had their own representative who was part of these 500 council. I just want to attract your attention. They were all men. We were not supposed to have women, not even in the level of representatives, not even as citizens. This structure was started to be more on the 507 year. The number of representatives from each dema was roughly increased to its population and reflected proportional to the number of the citizens or the demographic element for each territory. The council's use of representatives, though chosen by lot rather than the by election, first had down the election of representatives in later democratic system. So the system to choose these people or these representatives or these 500 representatives was a little bit ambiguous. Another important political institution in Athens was the popular court. This court called Dicastria. Dicastria was a pattern, or let's say a face of the democratic system in Athens, described by one scholars as the most important organ of state. Alongside the assembly with the unlimited power to control the assembly, the council, the magistrates, and the political leaders. The popular courts were composed of jurors chosen by lot from a pool of citizens over 3 years of age. The pool itself was chosen annually and also by lot. The institution is a further illustration of the extent to which the ordinary citizens of Athens were expected to participate in the political life of the city. We cannot deny that these are attempts, they are a way to try to involve others in the political participation, to ask others to be part of the structure. But honestly, we cannot say it is purely democracy because it's still ambiguous. It's still having certain criteria that disrespect the idea of human being. In 411 BCE, exploring the unrest created by Athens' disastrous and seemingly endless war with Sparta, a group known as the 400 seized control of Athens and established an oligarchy system. This period of time was one of the most darkest times for Athens actually. Less than a year later, the 400 were overthrown and democracy was fully restored. 9 decades later, in 321, Athens was subjugated by its more powerful neighbor to the north, which introduced property qualifications that effectively excluded many ordinary Athenians from the demos. In 164 BCE, what remained of Athenian democracy was extinguished by conqueror Romans. Okay, after Athens, I think it would be so proper to talk about the Roman Republic. And as you saw in the previous discussion, the Roman Republic is the replacement of the Athens state. The Roman Republic, at about the same time that popular government was introduced in Greece, it was appeared on the Italian structure in the city of Rome. The Romans called their system a Respublica, or a republic, from the Latin words. This means a new form of government and structure that built upon the structure they already have in that time. The thing that belonged to the Roman people, the idea of the population behind the government itself. Similar to Athens, Rome was originally a city-state, although it expanded rapidly by concrete and very quick changes far beyond its original border to the Mediterranean world and much of Western Europe. Its government remains in its basic features that of a huge features of a new structure based on these changes. This also changed the idea of the city-state to a large city-state. It is not a state or a city as much as a combination of occupied places. Indeed, throughout the Republican era, until roughly the end of the 1st century, Roman assemblies were held in the very simple small firm at the center of the city. There is a very important question we need to raise here. Who constituted the Roman demos? So Roman citizenship was conferred by birth, it was also granted by nature and by we can say the social economic structure of the state, because there is still the structure between slavery and what they call them the original Roman. As the Roman Republic expanded, it confirmed citizenship in varying degrees to many of those within its enlarged boundaries. Because Roman assemblies continued to meet it in the form, however, most citizens who didn't live in or near the city itself were unable to participate and were thus effectively excluded from the demo. Despite their reputation for particularity and creativity and all the participation, it was also many changes in the structure of the government over the course of centuries. The Romans never solved the problem of who is in and who is out of the track. It was totally unsolved and ambiguous how they classify the number of people who should participate and who should be included. As they adapted to the special features of their city, including its rapidly increasing size, the Romans created a political structure which was so complex, so ununderstood. They call it idosynocratic, that later democratic leaders choose not to emulate it. The Romans used not only the extremely powerful of Senata, but also 4 assemblies, each called comitia or assembly. These assemblies or comitias or committees later on was composed of 3 local groups drawn from three ancient tribes. These structures consisted of 193 centuries, or they were formed of military units. This changes and the structure itself reflects the development of the era and the development of the mentality of people who were in charge. But the dilemma was there: who is the citizen? The current dilemma was still similar to what Athens used to suffer from: who is inside the round or the circle of citizenship. In all the assemblies, votes were counted by units, by tribes, rather than by individuals actually. Thus, and so far as a majority prevailed in voting, it would have been a majority of units, not of citizens actually. And that was a little bit ambiguous and uncomfortable, because you might have like 3 units, 3 tribes. The total amount of their citizens equal one other tribe, but they have the majority to vote. Although they collectively responded and representation of all Roman citizens through the assemblies were not sovereign. The ability to determine who is in the level of authority was unclear. Throughout the entire period of Republic, the Senata, an institution inherited from the earlier era of the Roman monarchy, continued to exercise great power. Senators were chosen indirectly by the committees during the monarchy system. They were drawn exclusively from the privileged classes through later on the families, the tribes. During the Republic, members of certain tribes and family were also admitted. So the criteria there, either being part of the monarchy system, tribes, aristocratic families, etc. We're going to talk about the change in the Italian republics from the 20th century till the Renaissance. Renaissance is one of the most important stages in the age of political science in general. We're going to talk in a very deep way about the Renaissance age. After the Western Roman Empire collapsed, the Italian broke up into certain categories of smaller political entities. About 6 centuries later, in northern Italy, some of these entities developed into more or less independent city-states and started to upcome or developed into certain government based on a wider, though not fully popular participation, and on the election of leaders for limited periods of time. In this respect, their governments may be viewed as a small scale of later representative system. Such governments were developed through centuries, maybe 2 or 3 more centuries, a number of cities, including, for example, Venice. Venice was one of the first cities that changed the structure of Italian towards the Renaissance. Drawing on Latin rather than Greek, the Italians called their city-state republics, not democracies, and this is one of the most interesting parts. Although membership and demos was at first restricted mainly to the nobility and large landowners, in some republics in the first half of the 13th century, groups from lower social and economic classes, such as the newly rich, small ownership, bankers, skilled craftsmen, organized in certain categories, and we can add to them foot soldiers commanded, started to be part of this class who are allowed and welcomed in the government in a way. Because they were more numerous than the upper classes, and because they threatened, actually, in a way, the upper class, and sometimes carried out violent uprisings, some of these groups were successfully made their path to the government. Even with these additions, the demo and the republic remained only a tiny fraction of the total population, ranging from 20% to, in the best cases, 15 to 17 percentage of the entire population of the population of the entire citizens. The best percentage actually was seen in Venice, where there is an admission to the ruling nobility had been permanently closed during the 14th century. Whether judged by the standards of classical Greece or the Europe and the United States until the 18th century and later, the Italian republics were not democracies. A more accurate characterization proposed by the historian Lord Martins is the constitutional oligarchies. So this term can reflect and represent the idea of the growth of both Italian, Roman, and Athens democracies. After about the mid-14th century, the condition that had favored the extension of independent state city and wider participation in government, particularly their economic growth and the civic loyalty of the population, gradually disappeared. Economic decline, corruption, factional disputes, civil war, and wars with other states led to the weakening of some republican governments and their eventual replacement with authoritarian ruler, with monarchy, princes, soldiers. Actually, we can wrap up all what we talked about today with three main elements: history, economic, the changes of the structure of the community and society led to the new phase of democracy. So each country, each community has their own phase of democracy. Thank you for joining me in this. See you in our coming lecture. Be safe.